Good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Weinberg, the Alice Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney Museum. And thank you. Where's my mom when I need her here? I mean, it's great. She'd be so proud. Anyway, I wanted to welcome you to tonight's program about the life of Alexander Calder and a discussion between two people, Sandy Rower and Jed Pearl, who probably together know more about Calder than Calder himself knew about Calder, I suspect. Tonight we're here especially to celebrate Jed's book, Calder, The Conquest of Time, the early years, 1898 to 1940, and it's the first biography of Calder. And it traces Calder's life from Greenwich Village in the 1920s to the left bank of Paris during the Depression, and then back to the United States. Jed's book demonstrates, to my mind, why Calder was and remains a barrier breaker and an avant-garde artist, even seen in today's light. He reveals how Calder's magnetic personality and synthetic thinking determined a radical new course for 20th century art. And I have to say, I've been privileged because I've already read the book, although in a slightly earlier draft. And it's amazing how one can jam so much information into something and make it so not just readable, but incredibly compelling story that just has this urge that makes you want to keep going and keep going. And that doesn't often happen with biographies. Fiction, yes. Biographies, no. And so I really recommend that you all get your copies outside, although I'm not here for sales. This book has been, I gather, a decade in the making, and it's based on unprecedented access to the artist's letters, papers, and he did scores of interviews. And I have to say that if it weren't for Sandy, who has now been running the foundation for actually 30 years this year, which is hard to believe because I still think of Sandy as 30 years old. He has done an extraordinary job with the foundation, and those works, those materials wouldn't be here if it weren't for Sandy. Tonight also, it's kind of bittersweet for us because we mark the close of an extraordinary exhibition called Calder Hypermobility, which was here at the Whitney. I hope a lot of you saw it. And this was a collaboration between the Whitney Museum and the Calder Foundation. And for us, this was what I would call Calder mania. The galleries have never been so crowded. And it was truly remarkable to see people there for the performances of the works. We had people, what did we call them again? I keep calling them manipulators. Thank you, activators. I kept calling them manipulators. That doesn't sound so good. They were activators. We had special coats for them. They had special tools. They had special training. And this became something that everybody in the museum would all of a sudden rise up to the 8th floor to be there for the activation, not the manipulation. Thank you. So anyway, this was, in fact, I think one of Calder's, the first exhibitions, believe it or not, to focus specifically on the notion of motion in terms of Calder's work. And I think, and Calder once said, just as one can compose colors, so one can compose motion. And I think to see all these different kinds of motion, the taxonomy of motion, in effect, all the different types of motion, from slow, almost imperceptible, to things that were just very free, and things that were kind of pop and surprising. I never even knew that the range of motion was existed in his work. We're particularly proud because Calder, other than maybe Edward Hopper, is the artist most identified with the Whitney Museum. But like any great artist, perhaps like few great artists in some ways, his work is truly inexhaustible, and it invites continual study and revisitation. And with that in mind, the Whitney has organized many exhibitions, including Calder's Universe in '76, celebrating Calder in 1991, Alexander Calder, the Paris Years, which I remember so fondly working on, which was here and at the Pompidou Center, which we did together, and collecting Calder in 2014. Calder, as a young artist, became a member of the Whitney Studio Club. I don't think any of you remember that, but the Whitney Studio Club existed between 1914 and I think it was around 1918. It was the predecessor of the Whitney Museum. In 1926, he participated in the studio's 11th annual exhibition. And again, this is 5 years before the museum opened. And from 1942 to 1970, Calder's work was included in 21 annuals and biennials, which is an extraordinary number. In the 1970s, the museum began to acquire deep holdings of the artist's work, and I want to particularly thank the Lippman family, Howard and Jean Lippman. Howard was one of the first presidents of our board. Jean Lippman, who was a great scholar, writer, editor. Peter and Bev Lippman are here tonight, and I want to thank you for your continuing support of Calder and your great belief in Calder's work. And the great thing is when you see these works in the museum and then see everybody there, you understand what the connection is about. Actually, I will finish up because I know they're really here to see you, but I always forget. Am I having too much fun? Okay. But you know what's sad? It's always such a good time. He's my long-lost brother. But, so I just wanted a quick word about Jed Perl. Jed is a contributor to the New York Review of Books. He was the art critic for the New Republic for 20 years. His previous books include Magicians and Charlatans. I love his titles. Antoine's Alphabet, New Art City. And New Art City was the New York Times notable book in the Atlantic Book of the Year. In 2010, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship. He received a Leon Levy Biographer Fellowship. And in 2003, he received the Visiting Critic Award from the American Academy in Rome. And a shout out to my friend Sandy, Alexander S.C., otherwise known as Sandy, is founder and president of the Calder Foundation, and I think many of you know, but if you don't, he's the grandson of the artist. I also want to give a shout out. There's a lot of the Calder family here, and I see Sandra and Holton and so many other people, but I just want to welcome you always here in the museum. And since 1987, Sandy has documented 22,000 works by Calder. I think it's actually more than 22,000. He'll correct me. And as I mentioned earlier, he's created the most extraordinary archive of the artist's career. He is the steward of the single greatest collection of Calder works, as he reminded me not long ago, that their collection is greater than all of the top 5, including the Whitney's and the Pompidou's collections of Calder's works altogether. And the Whitney has 184 works, which is nothing to sneeze at, and we're very proud of. It's a good beginning. Well, you can help us? Got to be careful, Sandy. And so I just wanted to mention also that he has curated and collaborated in those 30 years on over 100 Calder exhibitions, all on all parts of the globe. And they include the Tate Modern, the Pushkin Museum in Asia, and many other places. So I would just like to close by saying I feel very pleased and proud that we're having the kickoff for your book here tonight. It seems like this is the home for Calder. And I want to just say that congratulations. It really is wonderful. Sandy, thank you for all you do, not just for Calder, for the arts in general. I think, you know, what Sandy has done, it's really interesting. We're about to have here a conference of artists' foundations. And I have to say, the Calder Foundation is really the foundation that is considered truly the paradigm of all foundations. It's extraordinary what Sandy has done. As they say, you could sell snow to Eskimos. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for all being here tonight.
Thank you, Adam. Are we done?
We can go now.
Good.
That was good.
So relieved.
Yeah. So you think you're done, but you're not. He's got a second volume coming out in 2 years. So.
Dun, 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 dun.
Dun, dun, dun. How's it going?
It's going.
Yeah? How's volume 2?
Well, it's happening. It's happening. We've got the jazz playing in Roxbury, 1950.
So the way we work is I wrote him an email 3 days ago. Did I ever tell you about Willie the Lion Smith? Now, most of you don't know that he's a famous jazz star from the 20s, really, and 30s. And he played in the Calder House. I always remember the names of these jazz stars. I love jazz, and Willie the Lion Smith was this great pianist. And so I'm always sending Jed these little notes, because I've forgotten after 10 years, did I tell you or didn't I tell you?
So then I sent him back a memoir he'd never seen by the son of a good old friend of Calder's, the writer Malcolm Cowley, who was a very close friend of Calder's, and his son, who was just home from Exeter for vacation and just was getting into jazz, goes over to these old family friends, the Calders.
Yeah.
But
we
how
don't
did you?
sleep much.
But you? Why hasn't there been a biography for all these years, Mr. Rower? How did this
He
happen?
thinks that's funny. So, as part of my job, I've got to protect my grandfather's legacy, and I counted, back when we began, I counted that I had politely suggested to 15 biographers to not write a biography, or to go write one but not have access to the Calder Foundation's archives. Because I didn't take them sincerely. You know, when a biographer who's written 15 biographies walks in the door and says, I want to write a book on your grandfather, I know there's a show opening at the Whitney in 18 months, and I want to get this book out, you can't take that seriously. That's a joke. I mean, that's just read an article or something, but not a biography. That's why. You know that. He's just teasing me.
But there was also a biography written in the 1950s by a friend of Calder's and Sandy's, and his wife Louise is a friend of theirs, a guy named William Rogers. They actually encouraged him to write a biography. He had been in Paris in the early years of the century. He'd written a book about Gertrude Stein, and I think your grandfather thought he would do a book that they would like. But when Calder and his wife got the typescript, they were horrified and basically deep sixed the thing. So I actually think there's kind of, that began back in the mid-50s, a sort of tradition in the family of ambivalence about biography. But here we are.
Well, biography is a story.
Yes, yes.
It's not a fact. So when you write a biography, you choose, like any good journalist, you choose the stories you want to tell that tells the broader picture. You can't tell every story. You don't know every story. And there's so many stories we'd like to know about, that I'd like to know about, that I don't know what the answer is, and there's no way to know the answer, so we'll never know the answer to the story. So you find little stories and you weave them together. Right? It's a story. Is it not?
It is, but I mean, one of the, I've never written a biography before, and I never tend to write the same kind of book twice. And one of the things that interested me about this whole project, along with writing about this amazing artist who spans 2 continents and 2 different art worlds, and who moves from sort of avant-garde insider to an artist who, while always remaining an avant-garde, is enormously popular. And I mean, aside from just the story of Calder, I was interested in the problems of biography, you might say. And the thing I frankly came to feel about a lot of biographies is that they're so intent on telling a single story and trying to kind of telling the story and wrapping everything together very neatly into a story, that especially when you're dealing with the life of an imaginative artist, they smooth it out too much. So one of the things that has interested me in writing this book is this incredible question of, I mean, the imagination of a genius is, it is literally an awesome thing. And how does it operate? What kinds of things impact on the imagination of a genius? And one of the things I do in this book is, like, when you come to think, like, how does Calder begin to make sculpture move? Why does he do that? What compels him? You know, and I think a lot of biographies, it's just sort of, it happens one day, or people find that they like to find a sort of psychological switch that goes this way, and then suddenly the person's doing this. And what I was really wanting to do was show these kind of multiple levels and almost circles of impact and influence that range. We talk about kinetic art and Calder. You start with things like, here's a guy who, even in college and just after college, he loved physicality. He was a terrible athlete, absolutely the worst athlete at Stevens.
He was pretty good.
But he loved to move on the athletic field. He was a crazy improvisational dancer, but an avid dancer. And he was very into bike riding. And so there's that, you go from something as kind of visceral as that, and that's part of what's behind the mobiles. But at the same time, if you broaden the perspective, you start looking at France and the avant-garde circles that Calder is moving in the late 20s and 30s. There was a lot of talk about dimensions beyond the third dimension. Not only the fourth dimension, but the fifth dimension, the sixth dimension. There's a crazy Russian mystic, mathematician named Ouspensky. And people Calder knew, and I show this in the book, were really into this stuff. And some people thought the fourth dimension was time. Now, Calder himself, I think, occasionally mentioned the fourth dimension, but not a lot. But part of what I'm trying to do here is set up these multiple rings of impact. And so you kind of move around, and it's not just one thing, but this kind of multiplicity of influences and coming at a man from different angles. And if you're a genius, most ordinary people would miss half of it or wouldn't know how to put it together. But a genius is kind of walking through it, moving through it, and absorbing all of it. And then out of that comes the first mobiles.
Well, among the many remarkable features of your book, you have set up the early years, the pre-Calder years, it was such an amazing lust, really. You talk about his parents. So for those of you who don't know, my grandfather's father was a sculptor and his mother was a painter. And they grew up in Philadelphia, and they knew all the great American artists of their day, all the Ashcan.
Well, they were close friends with, Calder's father was close friends with John Sloan and
all those guys.
Everett Chin.
Yeah.
And all those,
and George Lukes and
all
all of them.
Close
But the way you bring the whole story together and talk about who they were, Calder's parents, no one else has ever done that before. Not even.
Well, it's also partly because, myths grow up in funny ways. And I think partly because Calder grew up in this artistic family. His mother was a rather brilliant painter. She was also a pioneering feminist, which nobody had ever realized. His father was an enormously famous sculptor in the 1920s. And Calder grew up in this, surrounded by all this art stuff, and found it rather oppressive. And his father, his father died in 1945 when Calder has already had a retrospective museum on art. I think Calder wanted to separate himself in some way, from that influence. He needed to. He's a kid. He's grown up. He's got to move away from his parents. So I think partly, in a funny way, I'm trying to restore a story that Calder himself, in a way, transformed, because he wanted to show how, for him, the important thing was how he moved ahead, right, and became Calder. And I think what got lost, and then these myths started that, he went to school to study engineering. And then a sort of myth started that his parents didn't want him to be an artist and sort of forced him to be an engineer, which is just completely wrong. So part of what was...
Well, they didn't want him to suffer.
No, well,
they had suffered. They had spent their lives suffering, and they didn't want their son to suffer.
And I always say to people, Calder was, when they were in San Francisco when he was in high school, and he went to like a special public high school, sort of like Hunter College High School is in New York, for like bright kids. And he was like a whiz at math and science. He had the answers before anybody else. But he was also very lackadaisical. And he would just kind of have a shit grin on his face. And if you asked him what he wanted to do, he'd say, I don't know.
You say shit?
Yeah, I did.
You said shit. Oh, my God.
Okay. And so
Gloves off.
Parents, his parents, these very serious people. And so they're these very serious people with a very smart, but somewhat they see as haphazard son. So you can imagine, they're like, what the hell is going to happen to him? So they were trying to kind of move along. And the truth is, when he finally decided he wanted to be an artist, it's his mother who sent him paints. So once he decided on that, they were there.
And that was to be a painter, not a sculptor.
Right. Well, he always had this way of backing himself into, he sort of decided first to become a painter, and then he backs his way into sculpture. And then interestingly enough, when in 1930, he goes to Mondrian's studio and he has this revelation about abstract art. I mean, I think there are other reasons why he became an abstract artist at that point too. But he has this revelation. Interestingly enough, he first starts by painting again and then moves into abstract sculpture. So there's always, for him, maybe it was because sculpture was Dad's thing. I don't know. So he kind of backed his way in through Mom's thing. I don't know.
I think he felt a little insecure. When he first left Mondrian's studio, it was the studio environment, the rigor of the placement of everything in the environment, which had the impact on him that a spatial relationship of everything could be a work of art. Not that Mondrian saw it as a work of art, but Calder perceived it as an artistic space. And that really had that push, the finality of pushing him into abstraction. But if you look at the abstract work, so those first couple of dozen paintings in October 1930 are small scale, mostly, a couple larger ones. But I think he was a little intimidated to be fully abstract. And then the first abstract wire sculptures, he's gone back to the formality of a wooden base. If you look, the Whitney has one of these early sculptures. But there's like a plank that he's cut, and then a wire sculpture erupts out of it. As the very first abstractions. And if you look back to the wire sculpture of the figurative period, in the mid-20s, those also, the early ones have these formal bases like a bronze might, or, the volumetric line in space has a wooden base. So he repeats that in sort of this gentle way.
I mean, one of the, like you said, the Mondrian story, which is, I mean, Calder was not a hero worshiper, and I think the closest he ever came to what you might call hero worship was his feelings about Mondrian. It's the one time he kind of fessed up to a revelation, a revelatory experience. But in a way, also the way he tells it makes it a little too simple, because, the idea that he walks into the studio and suddenly he's an abstract artist is doing him a disservice in a way. And one of the things, again, in trying to sort of kind of move around the story more, I tried to think about a lot of the whole question of, here's a very smart guy. He's been in the art scene in New York since the mid-20s. He's been in Paris in the late 20s and early 30s. He's obviously seeing a lot of abstract art. But the thing he says, the thing he says at some point about Mondrian's studio was, he says, Mondrian's studio was like the slap you give the baby after the baby's born to get it breathing, which is a really brilliant analogy, because that isn't what makes the baby breathe. Okay, the baby has the capacity to breathe, but it's something that jumpstarts it. And my feeling is, it wasn't just the environment of Mondrian's studio, but it was also Calder. Before he went to Mondrian's studio, he couldn't feel abstract art in his heart. He couldn't feel it in his kishkas, as you say in Yiddish.
A kishka?
Kishka.
What's that, Michael? A stomach.
So,
okay.
And he goes in there, and one of the things about Mondrian was the singular figure. He was in the midst of this Parisian art world, which was not there was not that much abstraction being done in Paris in 1930. Some, but not that much. And he was this kind of figure unto himself who seemed to have this clarity and determination and kind of wholeness about what he was doing. And I think that was very important for your grandfather as well. I mean, this was sort of the total. It was like he saw a way to do this, to be this somehow, to be himself and do these things. Because here was a man who was being himself and doing this. I think that was, it was kind of, it sent him, it didn't give him all the answers, it just kind of, it gave him that push he needed.
Well, I think we should fill him in because we haven't actually told him the story. Calder walks into this studio, which is a 5-sided room with cross light, and on the back, the tall back wall, are colored rectangles of cardboard. They've been painted different colors that are recomposable for compositional experimentation by Mondrian. Different whites, red, blue, and so on. Shiny whites, flat whites, different color whites. And Calder makes the ridiculous suggestion these should be made to oscillate. And that actually pissed off Mondrian.
No, he said they're fast. My paintings are fast already, is what he said. Which is
actually,
really...
that's not what he said. He said that later. when Calder was speeding up those motorized contraptions in
you're wrong.
1932.
No, he really said.
No, you're wrong.
Where's that damn book? But the other thing you're not telling about the studio is Mondrian lived in actually two weird spaces. They were actually in different buildings. And you first came into this very dark bedroom. And then you went
Up the
through
stairs.
a passage up into another room, which was actually another building, where there was this astonishing light. So it was kind of like,
It's theater.
It was this revelation. And as I quote in the book, there are all these accounts of people. your grandfather was not the only person. People went there. It wasn't that many people. It was maybe 50 or 70.
The whole art world went there.
Right, but that was the avant-garde. But people, it was like this revelatory experience. The other thing, just the thing about kind of circles of impact. The other thing that occurred to me at some point that I think nobody's ever talked about in relation to Calder, and abstraction is, when does Calder become an abstract artist? In 1930, okay? Now, if you think of the Calder wire sculptures, the Josephine Bakers, those fabulous Josephine Bakers, and the dancers, and the Jimmy Durante and these funny heads, they are to me one of the great personifications of the spirit of the Roaring '20s, of the late '20s. Calder arrives in Paris at the point where the Charleston is at its climax of popularity. Now, imagine Calder in 1932 or 33, when Europe is coming apart, when Hitler's coming to power, doing Josephine Bakers. Okay, they would have become a kind of Art Deco, stupid, cliche joke. And I think in some way...
Well, that might be overstating it, but...
Yeah, but in some way, what he had been doing couldn't be done anymore.
Yeah.
After the catastrophe of 29...
What was the crash, yeah.
The world changed, and he responds to that, not in some stupid, politically correct, they've told me I better do this kind of way, and of course, to certain kinds of radical leftists, his art was escapist. Okay, you do a pure circle with a curve through it. It's like, is that why? That's not political art. But it was his, I think, very profound response, and he's not the only one who has a response, to a world gone completely awry.
But he realized he wasn't going to sell anything anyway.
Right.
So he could just do the work he wanted to do. As opposed to, in 1928, he made work to sell that had a certain amount of popularity. He didn't have any affront, there's no effect of being a popular artist by 1932. He just made these very strange contraptions, of which we have a couple upstairs, actually. Well, I guess
I don't like foregrounding the money thing too much.
No?
No.
What about Louisa?
What?
Foreground Louisa's son, then.
Well, there's an argument that Calder marries meets in 29 and marries at the very beginning of 31, a woman who comes from a family with money, and one of the various theories is that once they had her monthly check, then he didn't have to worry about selling things.
Well, it wasn't that much money.
It wasn't that well, though it went fairly far in France. Again, there are these multiple. Nothing in experience is one thing, One of the most wonderful thing in a way that Calder ever said, I think, about Louisa, he had met her in 29, going on a boat back to the U.S., and she was from a kind of offbeat Boston Brahmin family, a great niece of Henry James. Her father was a kind of eccentric leftist at that point. And she was in her mid-20s and already been living quite a free life, living in Paris by herself and living in New York with a sister. And I think she's sort of been dreaming of meeting some wild, wonderful bohemian dude. And there he is on the ship. I think she was so shocked that her dream had come true that's why it took her a year to finally adjust to the fact that this actually was real. But he said a friend of Calder's in Paris from the very early years, a great painter named Stanley William Hayter. And Hayter hadn't met Louisa or had met her and not got to her, but he said to Calder at one point, right early, this is like 1930, "What does she do?" And Calder said to him, "She's a philosopher." And I say in the book that I think she became the philosopher of his art in a way. And I think she was, Calder was this kind of ebullient, just what the hell, let's go ahead and do it, fearless person. And she was, she went along on every adventure, but she was a kind of more contemplative, quiet, different kind of personality. And I think that may have had something to do with the abstraction. In fact, Calder's early abstractions were often talked about in relation to Plato and the idea of Platonic solids. And oddly enough, in the one of the books with his wife's maiden name in the attic in the family house in Roxbury, Connecticut, is a book of Socratic dialogues that she was reading probably 2 or 3 years before she met him. So I think it was an extraordinary marriage. It really, really was. Very. I think they were incredibly happy together.
So how did you decide to end your book in 1940?
Well, first it was all supposed to be 1 volume, right? You kept telling me it was going to be 2 or 3.
I was saying 3 volumes.
What did you say? 40? 1940. Yeah.
Is that wrong?
40. No.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, once we realized we had to have 2 volumes, we had to do something.
Why that year?
Why that year?
Yeah.
Well, there are a couple. Again, it's multiple reasons. I thought beginning Volume 2 with the oncoming wave of European emigres brought over by World War II, and the Calders, who were bilingual and very, people talk about a global outlook now. These people were globalists. They and their friends as a kind of brotherhood and sisterhood that crossed borders. And so there's a wonderful story at the beginning of Volume 2 of all these friends. Some were friends in Europe coming, and many of them come up and live in Connecticut. And then people like Saul Steinberg, who they hadn't known in Europe. Steinberg arrives in New York, and he's there with them practically weeks later. They were the people you went to. Also true, by the way, a few years later, South Americans who do French were all coming to America and getting connected with them. They had this vision. Calder was always very much in some sense an American, but at the same time international. There was you could be these different things. But also I felt I wanted to end on a big note. And I feel that I end with a chapter called The Classical Style. And I think that it's hard, you can't put a day on it, but 39, 40, 41, I think what we call the wind-driven mobile, which you think of as the classic Calder mobile, which often people think of as being a kind of horizontal thing that moves around like this. He arrives at what I would argue is the classical moment, and I talk about the idea of classicism as a balancing of different forces. And I also think at that point, all the tools in his imaginative toolbox are there by the mid to late 30s. And they're all there at his command. Now, as the years go by, he'll do different things with them. In the mid-40s, there's this crazy series of stables that are like overburdened. There's so much stuff on them that you think they're like anti-minimalists. They're the opposite of minimalist. But then a few years later, he'll do something radically simplified. He goes back to the figurative stuff. I love the fact that he goes back to the figurative stuff. And then in the later years, in the 70s, there's a wonderful sort of experimentation with crazy figures again. And then I think probably one of the very last masterpieces, which he went down to Washington to deal with the day before he died. Singular, Mountain and Cloud or Mountains and Cloud, I can't remember what it's called.
Mountains and Cloud.
Mountains and Cloud, where he takes this idea of angular elements and elements hanging, and which people I think for a long time been saying, oh, it kind of looks like a mountain or something. He's often pushing that kind of idea away. He's very clear on where he wants things to be in relation to nature, and some of his things are radically abstract, like these sculptures of the early 30s that you adore, and I think for you are in ways some of the ones you love the most. Yeah?
I love everything.
Right. But then he does this really interesting thing at the end where he'll play with the idea that these kind of mountain-looking forms are actually mountains. And there's even a series of weird thing called crags, which are like, where he makes almost Japanese landscapes out of metal. And these things, by the 70s, I think a lot of the really sophisticated people thought, oh, he's just become a kind of old, nutty guy, you know. Who's
Well,
just,
they saw him as being focused on his monumental sculpture,
Right.
and that this gallery sculpture
Right.
was sort of an.
But I think one of the things I really want to do in the second volume is talk about how extraordinary a lot of this stuff is. And one of the things I love about Calder and writing about him is it's not one single line. Like, you know, I can't imagine writing a biography of Mark Rothko. I mean, just the idea that you sort of, you kind of pare it down in the same direction. And it's not for me, it wouldn't be exciting. One of the great things about Calder is he switches and then he does something else. And, you know, even simultaneously with these big monumental things, within a year, there's the Expo 67 sculpture, which is to me like some crazy Gothic cathedral with all these things. And at the same time, he does, for the Olympics in Mexico City in 68, this radically simplified thing, which is basically a tripod with a single disc. And those two things are like radically different. But I think partly he's saying, I have this range of expression. And I think you can probably, you know, El Sol Rojo, the Mexican one, I think also is a response to the Red Sun as a whole Mexican, you know, tradition. I mean, they're just, it's just such a rich career.
So I take that back when I said I love everything. I was just really joking. I don't love everything. And in my grandfather's work, and it takes a grandchild to be able to say that. It's difficult for my mother and my aunt who's here to say, oh, that's a terrible Calder, because they're, you know, the children of the artist is just more challenging. But for me, it's much more, it's not challenging at all. But you opened my eyes to that late work. So I never liked these crags, which I think more as Chinese painting actually than Japanese painting.
But it's Chinese, yeah.
And then these black figures. If any of you have been to the Bremen's home, these great collectors in Miami, they always have these open houses during Art Basel in Miami, and they have a whole bunch of these black figures as you walk into their house, and I've always sort of disregarded this body of work. But it was you that brought my attention to them right at the beginning of the book, you know, 8 years ago. And I started to rethink about that late work. And now we actually own one of those crags. We didn't own one. We've acquired one since in the collection, and another one of the figurative ones, the critters, they're called, because of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
That wasn't a question. That was just a comment. Yeah, I think it's important that the foundation look at, you know, the late work with great seriousness too. I've always just focused on the monumental sculpture of the last really 20 years of his life.
Well, one of the things that has astonished me about the monumental sculptures, you know, you think of, big abstract sculpture, sort of, ho-hum, yeah, that's everywhere. But Calder was at the forefront of the fight in the 1960s to put large abstract sculpture out of doors. And one of the things I just couldn't get over was when I started to look into the there's an abstract Calder at Lincoln Center. It's right near the Vivian Beaumont Theater. If you've seen the Vivian Beaumont Theater and the Opera House, which was donated by the Lippmans, Howard and Jean Lippman, to Lincoln Center. But for a long period of time, I think it's over a year or more, it was not going to be installed. Why? Because a man named Newbold Morris, who was the Parks Commissioner of New York City, and the Parks Commission controls the outdoor space there, was dead set against abstract sculpture out of doors in New York. This is in the mid-1960s.
1965.
Yeah. I mean, and there was literally, and it's one of these things where at first your grandfather was like, oh, whatever, you know, I don't care. And then it was like, I think he thought it was just going to work out. And then it really wasn't going to work out. And then they sort of had this whole thing, they had to get kind of everybody they knew on the case and get some special commission set up. And even like in 1969, when Grand Rapids installed a huge Calder, he made a huge sculpture for Grand Rapids, which was the first thing paid for with that, that sharing government money. This was a huge thing. And there's a fabulous woman who I had hoped would come tonight, Nancy, now Trudell, who was married to a kind of Grand Rapids gentry guy. And she was actually instrumental. She'd seen a movie about Calder when she was a kid. And your grandfather like bonded with this woman, this Midwestern, upper middle class housewife, because she actually persuaded Grand Rapids to take this thing, which the city people didn't want to. She always tells me I was very good at baking pecan pies, and I would just bring them around and keep giving to these guys, insisting until they finally came around. So the idea, I had no idea there was a battle.
But it wasn't just silly like that. I mean, she got Gerald Ford, who was a senator before he was president, was a senator from Grand Rapids. You got everybody involved.
But the point is, the idea that, again, this is something that's lost in your grandfather's life. The idea that he was, it's not just that, you have some sort of lefty art historians now who say, Calder was a corporate tool. He just did these big sculptures for the military-industrial complex. This has literally been written in scholarly articles. And the fact of the matter is, this is a man who had dreamed from the early 1930s about the idea of bringing monumental abstract sculpture into the public sphere. And after the war, a while after the war, beginning at the very beginning of the 60s, there began, first in Europe, to be some chances. And he really pioneered this stuff. And a lot of, Sarah and Judd, and a lot of this stuff, so often unacknowledged, actually comes in the wake of what he did. And because he became so popular, people sort of lost track of of how adventuresome and daring it was.
Well, like I said at the beginning, it's a story, and the military-industrial complex part of it is interesting because in the mid-'50s, Calder was honored with this kind of survey show that went around in Germany to multiple cities. It was 5 or 7 cities. That just went all through Hamburg and everywhere. And it was the U.S. Information Service that organized. It was a political gesture, but it was definitely, it was a tool of politics.
But who is it a tool of? I mean, you see, this is, if you believe that Western liberal democracy is an insidious bad thing, then that whole series of exhibitions, and Calder was not the only person. Okay. If you think that Western liberal democracy is a bad thing and that Stalinist and post-Stalinist Russia was a good thing, then that was bad propaganda. If you think that Western liberal democracy is a good thing, then it was good that Calder was sent around to...
But even if it was righteous, he was still a tool from a certain perspective.
No, I don't accept that. I don't. No.
Their agenda wasn't first art. Their agenda was first politics. That particular
You've
organization.
swallowed too much of the left interpretation of this. I really believe that.
I'm a lefty. That's what you're saying.
No, I really, I really believe that the effort, mostly by that people love to make these connections, which are or they are not there, to the CIA and things. But the fact is, the Museum of Modern Art spearheaded all kinds of efforts after the war to get American vanguard art into Europe. I mean, you have to understand, you had a battle going on, for instance, in France, where a lot of French intellectuals did not get off the bandwagon with the USSR deep into the 50s. And part of what people, I think, at the International Council at MoMA were trying to do was send the message that that America was not a kind of depersonalized capitalist dystopia, but that in fact it was a place where people were extraordinarily creative and were doing were using their imaginations in a way you couldn't in Eastern Europe.
Well, so a lot of these stories are about book 2.
Absolutely.
And I want to tell one last story about Nancy, who's name
Yeah,
was
yeah.
before was Nancy Molnix,
Yes,
from Grand Rapids, Michigan. She told me this story 1,000 years ago that was so extraordinary. Since she was the actual person that had driven this thing through and gotten this giant, it's really megalithic, giant sculpture installed in Grand Rapids, the morning of the dedication, and my brother and I we were there with our grandparents and our parents, and it was a big fiesta. But that morning, somebody came by her house and shot the window out of the glass of her front window in her house. Really extraordinary, frightening kind of thing. And the police came by, and the police said, oh, well, you know, somebody doesn't like that big red thing. And the sculpture was red. And it was determined by the police that it was an act against communism. Because the sculpture was red, it was a communist sculpture, and some local guy could have been a lady, I suppose, decided that, you know, she needed a lesson about communism. It's 1969. It's not that long ago. Terrible. Let's get back to the 1930s. So I break my grandfather's life up into different periods, and that's why I asked him why 1940. I was fascinated why you chose that year. So many things happened in 1936. It's such a pivotal year, and then in 37, he's back in Europe. He hasn't been in Europe since 33 to 37, which is a long time in those years for him.
Well, especially considering he'd been there on and off consistently from 26 to 30.
Yeah, yeah. So those missing years were really critical. He was in America and very, very productive in Connecticut at this farm they bought. But then returning to Europe, so in a way I would have thought 37 would have been a good date to stop the book. And so as you progressed and your manuscript progressed and you decided that was going to be the year, I was really fascinated how you made that choice.
Well, I think also we end with, I mean, the house in Roxbury, where some of you here have slept there, is really, it's kind of the, I don't know, it's the, I mean, I was going to say the ground zero, but we can't use that phrase anymore. I mean, it's kind of the Ur Calder place, and that's the Ur Calder studio, the studio he builds on it for his 40th birthday present to himself in 38. And the fact is, even in the 30s and 40s, people don't realize he and his wife, they spent a lot of time living in New York, actually. And in the later decades, although they come back there mostly every fall, there are decades in where they're more in France. But I think I also wanted to end with Roxbury and him. The last image in the book is of him in the Roxbury studio. Because I think it's sort of, and this sense of, I mean, there's an aspect among the many aspects of Calder's.
Although that photograph is from 1941, but who's,
true. What, 40?
41.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, 40 is an artifice.
Who's counting?
I mean, there are a lot of both things at the end of the book that are from 41. I mean,
yeah.
People don't, artists don't stop and start. But also this sort of, there's this Yankee aspect. Now, some people take exception to calling Calder a Yankee. I mean, some people feel Yankee is actually just New England. But whatever you will call it, there's that kind of American ingenuity, which is a real thing, I think. And that is somehow, you feel that studio is where that is kind of lodged in a way. So I think I also wanted to end with that.
But so you said Calder's birthday present to himself when he turned 40 was he built the studio in 1938 and he was 40. Yeah. But why do you think it was a birthday present? Because at the same time, he had just completed, or he was just gotten this commission for the Museum of Modern Art to make this giant mobile for the principal stairway at MoMA. It was a great moment in his career.
Say that, but before 40, he's gotten that commission.
Yeah, when you said in 1938 he built the studio as a birthday present to himself. Yeah. But is that poetic license, or do you really think it was a birthday present?
What do you...
Did you say that in the book? I don't remember the birthday present concept.
I can't remember. I don't know if I said it's a birthday present.
This is what we talk about all the time. Like, was it a birthday present? How do you know? Did you read that letter? So funny.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, just to support what Adam said, I mean, the Calder Foundation archive is an extraordinary thing. I mean, the depth and reach of those file cabinets. And it's not, I mean, I think I said this at some dinner a couple of years ago. I mean, it's really, I think, one of the great archives for the study of modernism. I mean, not just for your grandfather. I mean, I think as the years go by, people are going to also come to it for that. But it's like what they've done there is for each individual thing, like each exhibition, each work, there's a sort of expanding bunch of stuff around them and then interlinked in the most extraordinary ways. I mean, and the first 3 years I was there, I mean, I was working on this. Sandy would come by and say, "What do you think?" I say, "I have absolutely no idea." And they had answers to every question, and it was great. And then after 4 or 5 or 6 years, I was started asking questions where the answers weren't, and that was unnerving to me. But it also made me know that I was sort of getting to the point where I had a sense of what was, what was there. But because sometimes now I actually am now at the point where I can have a discussion with you about why something might not be what it was thought to be. In fact, one day. There's this great Josephine Baker wire sculpture which has been dated 1926 since 1943, since the MoMA retrospective, and I just became more and more convinced it could not be 1926, it was 1927. And so finally we made a compromise. In the book it says circa 1926, because Sandy said you can't, we've got to do this gradually, and it seems like a small thing, and in a way
it wasn't that we were going to do it gradually. It's not we're going to eventually call it 1927. Right, yeah. It's that you have a persuasive argument that it could be from 27, even though Sweeney, who was curating the show at MoMA, documented it, but Calder say so, as 1926 in the MoMA show in 43. So, we call it 1926 because that's what it's always been called. Right. Not that it's necessarily correct. Right. And you've got a great theory about it. So
I mean, but I think part of some of this can sound very pedantic, and some of it does get pedantic. And Susan Brower-Dam, who's the head of research there, who unfortunately was sick tonight and couldn't be here, but Susan and I sometimes it's like we're relieved to talk to each other because who else could care about us like such lunatics about things. But there's a deeper importance and a larger importance is because I think at some point you have a kind of comfort level with what you're talking about. I mean, and because also what you have to do with these things, and that's how at some point you have to have instinct does kick in. I mean, I sometimes say to people that I mean, as somebody who was in therapy, psychotherapy for many years. But the idea of being a shrink was something just I could never conceive of being. But I sometimes think that being a biographer is a little bit like being a shrink in that you get you're told stories, you get specific facts and other specific facts, and you're sort of trying to assemble out of it, some kind of a picture,
I think you'd be a great therapist, actually, but only
you have to sit there
only
for
for deceased people. You have great empathy for the deceased, so that'd be amazing. Should we ask some questions?
Yeah, let's ask some questions.
There might be 1 or 2 questions you guys would like to ask Jed.
Or Sandy.
I'm too shy to answer any questions.
You've seen how shy Sandy is.
Yeah. Does anyone have a question for us on any subject?
You said that you started at what age with Calder, or do you discuss his boyhood and so forth and his inventiveness? And so I'd like to know that. And also, when you were talking about how he first did mobile, it's thought that the circus had a lot to do with that, but didn't either of you bring that up?
Well, the circus is one of many. I mean, you don't want me to go on all I could go all night about the origins of the kinetic. I also think, one of the things, I'll just say one thing about the circus. The circus was very often described in the early years as a kind of marionette or puppet theater or show of some kind. And if you think about the idea of the marionette, okay, I mean, there are many kinds of puppets and marionettes. Some are manipulated from underneath. They're manipulated in actually all different kinds of ways. But the idea of a flexible figure manipulated by a single string, okay, and Calder did, at least in one instance, have a Josephine Baker wire held by a wire, okay, right? Yes, you'll acknowledge that. If you think about the idea of a figure hanging from suspended, and then some of you, I'm sure, here, and you start thinking about that, okay, and then you really start thinking about that. Some of you will come to a great essay by Kleist called On the Puppet Theater, one of the great essays in the Romantic literature, in which the marionette hanging from a single string is said by a dancer who goes to these folk puppet shows to be, this is sort of both more human and less than human. It's sort of divine. The marionette is a kind of super idealized human figure. And anyway, you can go from there to think about a mobile. A mobile is a kind of marionette hanging from a single string. And by the way, if you look at Jean-Paul Sartre's great essay about Calder, I think it goes back to Kleist. And the circus, and there are a lot of other moving toys, moving sculptures. He would push a sculpture on that seems, when you see it in a museum, a wire sculpture. There are films from the time of these things moving. So there's multiple moving things. As for the childhood, again, I won't bore people with what's done, I think, very well in the book, but I think Sandy, feels that one of the great revelations of this book is Calder, as a boy from ages 9 to 11 roughly, lived in Pasadena. Pasadena was one of the centers in the world of the arts and crafts movement. Calder's parents were close to a lot of those people. Calder does his first cut metal animals either in Pasadena or right after leaving. If you go down this road, okay, you will come to the conclusion that Calder's masterpieces are the great climax of the arts and crafts movement in America. Okay, and that starts when he's 10 years old or 9 years old.
There's a question back there. Somebody raised their hand.
Well, I was just curious. It seems like 1940 would be an appropriate year to end the first book, because 1941, of course, America would be dragged into the war, and we'd see the Constellation series. One of the great shows this last year, of course, was Aquavella and Pace both doing the Miro and the Constellations of Calder. And it's suddenly the world is a whole different deal. You know, we sort of similar to now. We sort of went from a xenophobia to dragged into this war. So I think it's an appropriate place to stop and move into Volume 2.
Well, Volume 2 literally begins with there's an architect, a guy named Paul Nelson, an American who actually fought for the French in World War I, ended up living in France, studying architecture, became close friends with Braque, married a French woman who was a weaver, and very important, he, again, one of these people is moving back and forth across the Atlantic, good friends with the Calders in New York in the mid-30s, goes back to France, brings the Calders there in 47. This is a man, Paul Nelson, who knew, close friends with Miro, Leger, all these people. The book, Volume 2, begins with a story that I found in the one of the memoirs of a man named Matthew Josephine. One of the mistakes a lot of art historians make is they just look at the art stuff. But Calder was friends with all these incredible literary figures. So Matthew Josephine, a great buddy of Calder's in Connecticut, writes in his memoir a book called Infidel in the Temple, great title. He remembers in 1940 going to dinner at the Calder's house in Roxbury, okay? And Matthew Josephine has been very involved in the New Republic, written about Wall Street for the New Yorker, very active in political and economic things. And they're at dinner, and the Nelsons have just escaped, made their way out of Europe in 1940 by the skin of their teeth, okay? And they're sitting in the Calder's house, 1940, and the people in America, they still, I think, can't quite believe what's happening, you know? And Nelson is speaking in apocalyptic terms about the rout of the French army. He says at one point, The Germans dropped naked women out of planes on the French troops. I mean, it's and Josephine is like he's like exaggerating. I mean, they can't quite believe that this country, the France they all love, is practically, it looks like it's going to vanish. So that's actually where Volume 2 begins. And yes, the constellations and look, I think among many other things, think of the idea of a constellation. I mean, this is again about, I think, along with many other things, about this idea of a kind of connections, the global, the international, which was their lifeblood. That's what they believed in.
Another question? I know there's some questions.
Was it easily done for Calder to have an exhibition at MoMA in '43 when his legacy is at the Whitney largely?
Was that what? I
Was
didn't get.
it easily done for Calder, or was for?
Calder was showing at that point with a man named Pierre Matisse, the son of the artist, who was. There weren't that many major dealers showing advanced abstract art in America at that point. And I think Pierre Matisse had a very close synergistic relationship with the Museum of Modern Art. The thing that was extraordinary is, a lot of the Europeans Calder knew had, and a lot of the European artists Pierre Matisse showed, and he showed most of the European artists, were having before that, or would have in the next couple of years, shows at the Museum of Modern Art. Calder was not the first, but he was the first abstract artist of his generation,
He was
American,
youngest.
yeah, to have a show there. But he had he had a relationship with the Museum of Modern Art since its founding in 20. Alfred Barr was interested and knew about Calder's work even before the museum began. So I think you'd have to say there are these sort of two parallel tracks. One of the wonderful things about the story of Calder is, and it becomes kind of a story of modernism in America as well as modernism in Europe, because somehow everybody who's like a key figure in the story of modernism in America, Lincoln Kirstein, the great impresario of not only the visual but the dance arts, intersects with Calder in 1930, and then again in the early 30s several times. All these people. So, the Whitney was not. The Whitney was not so much focused on. The fight for abstract art was going on at the Modern, not the Whitney at that point, I would say. And that show was sort of part of that.
Well, to more specifically address your question, Calder didn't really become a Whitney artist, quote unquote, until the 60s.
I wasn't going to say that.
Well, it's true because the Whitney and MoMA were very different institutions, but it was really because of Howard and Jean Littman,
yeah.
who were huge lovers of Calder and supporters of Calder, and bought many Calders and got the museum to acquire many Calders, and they donated many Calders, and they organized so many different things. Jean wrote 5 books on Calder, so it was their intensity that really made the Whitney become the place. And then Calder deposited the Circus in 1970 here. It had been in a couple of big retrospectives, and then the Whitney asked to borrow it, and it was deposited at, in a big showcase.
And he gave, things like the Brass family, this wonderful family of acrobats. He gave certain things to the Littmans under the understanding, as I understand it, that they were going to go to.
That I don't know, but we can ask Peter, who's sitting over there somewhere. Any other questions?
The other thing that should be said, about Calder, Jean Littman is the one who organized the great 1976 show that was up when Calder died in his younger daughter's house here in New York, which was kind of, it's a beautiful. He died with this amazing thing going on, with a lot of projects going on, and also died only blocks from where he'd really started out at the Whitney Studio Club and had first kind of romanced Louisa. That first
Are you
week.
foreshadowing the end of book 2? sounds like it.
Because he was in the house
Yeah.
the morning his grandfather died. I mean, it's part of what makes the end of the book absolutely amazing. That I have this little boy. How old are
You should interview me at some point. Any more questions for us? There's one way back there.
I just, with this Whitney and Momo, what about the great show at the Guggenheim?
In 1964.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary
But
retrospective. But, Calder is an artist.
Does the Guggenheim play no part in this, who owns what? And, how did it end up in the Guggenheim when these other two museums were
Easily answered.
Yes?
So the curator of the MoMA show in 1943 was James Johnson Sweeney. And Sweeney became the first professional director of the Guggenheim. And Sweeney wanted to do a show of Calder. And he began this show, and it was working on it for a number of years. And then Sweeney left the Guggenheim, actually, and Tom Messer came in, and Tom Messer's first project was this Calder show that was already on the books. And so Tom became the official curator of that show, and it happened at the Guggenheim. I mean, the Guggenheim has many Calder works, too, and MoMA has many Calder works, too, and many other museums have many Calder works, too. It's not that Calder is exclusively a Whitney artist. I think Adam, feels very loving towards Calder, which is great. We need a microphone down here. Oh.
I've just got my copy of the book. I'm dying to read it. Congratulations. And one of the things I'm particularly looking forward, Jed, to discovering is how you present the evolution of his reputation, of how he's really received by the art world and then more generally, because I've loved Calder forever, and one thing that struck me whenever I've done a little bit of work on him is that the gaiety, the humor, the lightness, the joy in his work is actually a barrier to some people taking him as seriously as he could and should be taken as a sculptural innovator. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Richard Serra and the precedent set for the 1969 Grand Rapids piece. My question would be, we know how phenomenally popular going to the Circus had been in Paris, and Mondrian and everyone would go to the Circus. But did the lightheartedness, the lighthearted side of Calder, prevent aficionados and scholars and critics from seeing the depth and profundity of his
Well,
work?
I mean, first, a lot of what you're asking is answered in Volume 2. I mean, one of the things that is at the core of Volume 1 is, and this is something that connects very much with something Sandy's been working on since that wonderful show you had at the Whitney in Mass 70 years ago, that small show, basically reconstructing the first abstract show. I mean, when was that? In that main floor gallery.
Wow, it was in 1987.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I have tried to do is reestablish something that got lost later on, which was that in the early 30s, Alexander Calder was at the very core of vanguard art in the West. It was a group of people in Paris. There was the Nicholson and Hepworth and the Pipers in London. It was the Gallatin and his collection in New York, and he was part of Jean Elion, with whom he was very close, moving back and forth. That's who he was, okay? And when Pierre Matisse took him on in the 30s, that's who Pierre Matisse took him on as, okay? He was the artist. He was one of that group of artists, okay? Now, and because the war decelerates everything in terms of reputation, the 43 MoMA retrospective, which I think is actually the fulcrum in the change to this sort of reputation as this other kind of artist, this very popular artist, that kind of new reputation really takes hold in the 50s. Now, ironically, people, the Circus, since it's been at the Whitney, everybody thinks Calder and the Circus. But the reality is, the only way you could see the Circus in the 1930s or 40s was if you were invited to a performance. That was after an opening, maybe at Pierre Matisse's apartment, maybe out in Roxbury, Connecticut. I mean, we once had a discussion somewhere about how many people actually ever saw the Circus performed. And it's, it's not the many thousands, okay? So the whole idea of Calder and the Circus is the Circus wasn't exhibited publicly as a sculptural work until the 60s. So there's that. I mean, there are a lot of things going on. To the larger question of what the reputation becomes, I would say that when you get into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Calder has a kind of multi-leveled reputation. Irving Sandler talked in the 60s, wrote actually in the 60s, about how important Calder was for people like Sugarman and Serra, for some of the vanguard sculptors, okay? And he was important for Smith, too. Now, for various reasons, because other critics, Clem Greenberg had gone down, thumbs down, it was confused. But there was a kind of undercurrent of deep curiosity about Calder in vanguard circles. At the same time, and more interest of that kind in Europe than in America, actually. And then there's this crazy reputation that gets, he's like Mr. Popularity. Now, I have come to feel that he himself sometimes was not his best, was a bit of an enemy to his own reputation. And this is because Calder could not tolerate idiots, okay?
That's where I get it from. I was wondering. That answers so much.
And one of the things that confused me for a long time is I would read interviews, and you read one interview with Calder, and like he's going to have a show at the Tate in Britain in the 50s or something, and some English newspaper reporter goes over to interview him in France, and he says, "What are you going to do in London, Mr. Calder?" And Calder says, "I'm going to go to the Tate, make sure the mobiles aren't bumping into each other, and then I'm going to go back to France." And you think, God, how stupid, okay? And then you read another interview, and he'll say, what really interested me about circuses in the 1920s was the abstract structure of the inside of the tent. And you think, my God, that's amazing. And then you look, and who did he say that to? He said that in an interview with Cleve Gray, a very serious painter. So one of the things I began to realize was, if a well-known, interesting French novelist came to talk to him for 2 days, he said the most amazing things. But then there are all these interviews where he's saying, he's just like, he wants to go back to the studio. He's looking at somebody. He has spent his life with people like Mondrian and Miro and Leger and Jean-Paul Sartre, and discussing the nature of art and being. And he can't start over lunch to explain what abstract art is. So I think, and a lot of that stuff got kind of distributed, and I don't think it helped, frankly. Well,
he stopped giving interviews because he couldn't stand these kind of ridiculous questions of people that really didn't deserve to ask him questions. And there's this great moment in the late 50s where he's on TV. TV was this new thing, right? And he was being interviewed in front of a bunch of his works, and the interviewer says, "Mr. Calder, when do you know when you're finished?" Meaning, how do you come to that sense of completeness when you're making a work of abstraction, but we don't understand if it's missing something, if it had another piece, or how do you put it together? And Mr. Calder said, "When it's dinner time." Now that's funny, except that he was really saying, you don't have the authority to ask me this question. I can't spend the next 3 hours on TV discussing what's the answer to your question. And so he made a joke out of it. And as you say, he was kind of his own worst enemy in that regard, because as your question pointed out, Calder's popularity really beginning in the 50s, but certainly in the 60s, when America woke up to culture, when people were buying Andy Warhol Marilyns in 1962 for their living room, they would buy a color for Calder to go over their couch, thinking they were contemporary artists, not realizing Calder's born in 1898. So it's a great question, and I think, Jed, I think you've done amazing. The first half really sets the groundwork to explain in the second volume, what that's all about.
Judd collected writings, they aren't included. But if you go back to the yellow volume of Judd's writings, which has all the reviews for Arts Magazine, where he did review a bunch of Calder shows at the Pearls Gallery, and he isn't, he says a lot of negative things. But if you actually read them carefully, and you think about these things without bases, which are sitting on the floor, and you read what he's saying, he's also seeing things there. And also those of you who remember the Pearls Gallery, which showed like Maurice Utrillo, Paris, a lot of school Paris stuff, some of it much better than some people give it credit for, but notice it was not the right space for people to make the connection between what Calder was doing and a Sarah or a Judd. But I think there's more of a connection than people actually see, and I think you can demonstrate historically.
Let's have 2 more questions.
Jed, I have a question. Jed, I'd like to step back from Calder for a minute and ask you as a writer, having grappled with this deep archive and your discovery of all of the relationships and countries that expanded Calder's life, did this work open you as a writer or confound you in any way?
Open me?
As a writer.
Well, I think every new writer, any creative person, every new creative challenge, kind of opens you up in different ways. I think it's a really it's a big question.
Are you going to write another biography after this?
No, I would never write another biography. In a way, it's maybe not a question at the moment for me to answer. I think some people have said to me that they think the writing sounds somewhat different than other writing I've done. I think one of the things that was interesting is, some of the writing I do, some essay writing where you kind of the thing you're writing about is there and you're here and you're in a relationship with it. There were some cases here where it was kind of an interesting challenge where I'm writing about criticism of Calder's work, and I'm trying, in a way, I want to be in relation with that person who's writing that criticism, but I had to be in that relation in a different. I had to also kind of be weaving all of that into the story. So I think it was an adventure in weaving different kinds of strands of things together than I ever had before. And as I said earlier, I just love the challenge of trying to do different kinds of things in writing. One of my great idols is Edmund Wilson, who just did. He wrote fiction, he wrote poetry, he wrote reportage, he wrote literary criticism of different kinds. He wrote kind of panoramic histories, and I love. In the same sense that I love the idea that Calder did so many different kinds of things. I guess I like testing myself against different kinds of forms.
Do you write poetry? I haven't read any poetry.
I did when I was a teenager, but you ain't seeing it.
Okay, one last question, I think.
I think there's been one here. You should let this woman actually.
How many things did Calder make?
What?
How many things did Calder make?
Well, we have a pretty good sense. I think we're now at 23,000 unique works, so that's quite a lot. We can squeeze in your question right there. I know you've been waiting so long for.
Like Andy Warhol or like Van Gogh or like Picasso, they all have their personal museum. Since Calder has so many works, how come there's no his personal museum?
Any other questions? So the answer to your question is, and that would be the last question for tonight, is that our foundation, which is this grand repository of works by my grandfather, makes projects all around the globe every single year. We do about 15 projects, like the Whitney show upstairs that just ended today, 15 of these projects in different cities all over the universe. So, and every one has a different curatorial vision, a different discussion, different body of work coming together from all different places and so on. And the people who come and view our exhibitions are 2.6 million people a year. So we run this kind of virtual museum with a giant audience. And it doesn't really make sense to make a museum like a Musée Picasso or any of these other single artist museums. I mean, there may one day be a reason to do that, but currently it's very effective to have our works be out in the public more often than they would be if we had a singular artist museum.
I would also just like to give a shout out to Sandra, okay, to Sandra Davidson.
Do you want us to say a shout out?
Who is
We're going to stand up? Come stand up, wave.
I just want to say that Sandra has, who's Calder's the older of the two daughters, and unfortunately Sandy's mother is no longer with us. But I just want to say thank you publicly to Sandra, who has been extraordinary in helping me see her father. I mean, I really, without Sandra and her generosity, which has been the generosity of the whole Calder family, but really Sandra has been an extraordinary partner in this endeavor. Really. So, thank you, Sandra.
Okay. Off we go.